Good evening, everyone, and also good afternoon and good morning to those who are connecting from other time zone, including our speaker today. Uh, so I will start by introducing obviously our speaker, but before that, let me briefly introduce our center for those who are not familiar. So the Dr. Kiran C. Patel Center for Sustainable Development at IIT Gandhinagar undertakes research in the area of sustainability with a focus area on fields such as air pollution, water pollution, energy, and of course, climate change. And as multiple goals of this whole center, we also run this Center Sustainability Seminar Series, where our aim is to bring prominent scholars and professionals in various areas of sustainability to IIT Gandhinagar campus in person or virtually like we are doing it today to discuss their works and perspective. So moving on to our speaker for the day, today we have Dr. Pallavi Pant, who is a senior scientist at the Health Effects Institute located at Boston. At her current position, Dr. Pant leads the Institute's Global Health Program. She has more than a decade of experience in research and public engagement on air pollution, particularly in low and middle income countries. In addition to expertise in urban area quality and including source apportionment and exposure monitoring and assessment, Dr. Pant also has extensive science communication experience and is active in several initiatives to promote public understanding of air pollution and its impact. Dr. Pant holds a Ph.D. in environmental health from the University of Birmingham, UK. With that, I would like to pass the mic to Dr. Pallavi Pant. If for all the audience member, if you have questions, please keep typing it on in our Q&A box, and we will take those questions towards the end of the talk. So Dr. Pant.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patel. I'm really excited to be here today and talk a little bit about our continuing engagement on trying to get towards cleaner air. But I want to start, not with the science or the numbers, but just with some pictures. What you see here in front of you are essentially two images from an airport, pretty much taken at the time of takeoff from one airport and then landing at the other. And the reason that this has been very fascinating for me is because they were taken at exactly the same time of the day. So, one of them is not from the morning and one at night, or early morning and early afternoon. They're exactly about the same time of the day, but they present completely different pictures of what the air quality levels are like and what the sky looks like. I wonder if anyone wants to hazard a guess on where these two images are from. You can type that in the chat if you think you know which cities we're looking at or which airports we're looking at. But what is presented here is essentially an image from the airport in New York in the middle of the day, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right at the time of takeoff. This was back in 2016, so a few years ago now. But around 3 o'clock when the flight was leaving from New York, and then the following day, around the same time, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we landed in Delhi, and here's what I could see outside. Pretty much nothing. It was very polluted, very hazy, and as especially those who live in and around Delhi might recognize, early November is the time when air pollution levels tend to be among the highest in the city, partly because of a confluence of some of the crop burning that happens further north, the changing weather patterns, and also in some cases, this is about the time when we have the Diwali fireworks. So the confluence of all of these results in conditions which basically render it impossible for us to see the sky. Forget about a blue sky. The sky is not visible And one of the things about air pollution or about, air quality that is really so central to all that we do or or we're trying to work on is that it's all around us. So we cannot really escape the air around us. We have to breathe in regardless of where we live, who we are. And this quote is from a book on air pollution by Beth Gardner. The book is called Choked. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. But essentially, the idea that air pollution is something that impacts all of us. And it does not matter whether we live in a rich neighborhood or a relatively poor neighborhood. It doesn't matter if we are working in an office or if you're working sort of outdoors. We are all breathing in the same air. And yes, of course, there are variations in how much of that we breathe in, because we can put in ways and methods to try and reduce our exposure. But ultimately, we all share the same air. And just so we are all on the same page, I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about some of the basics. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with these, but this will help us sort of think about the same framework as we go through the rest of the talk. So there are a lot of pollutants in the air around us, both pollutants that are listed here, some of the gases like nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, ozone, and also particulate matter, which is often the pollutant which is easiest for us to think about because that's what we get a lot of information on and we hear the most about. And for just some basics, the pollutants that are listed on the top in blue, so sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, particulate matter, these are all primary pollutants, which means that the sources that we generally think about, power plants, industries, waste burning, biomass burning, transportation, they are all emitting these pollutants directly into the air. There are other pollutants like ozone, which is a secondary pollutant, which means no single source is actually emitting this pollutant into the air, but it is being formed in the air through chemical reactions, and often nitrogen oxides are involved in the formation of ozone. So this is a pollutant that we're not really releasing into the atmosphere, but it is forming up in the air, and we still have to find ways to reduce it and control it. The other important frame to keep in mind is that often when we're thinking about air pollution, the easiest image that comes into mind is a busy road with a lot of traffic with tailpipe emissions coming out. But even in rural areas, air pollution is a huge problem, especially in a lot of places where people still use solid fuels for cooking. So they're either cooking inside their home or outside, and all of that emissions, the primary pollutant emissions are going out into the air that surrounds all of us. And then finally, there are sources of air pollution that are outdoor, things like industries, power plants, brick kilns, waste burning locations, but there are also sources that are inside our homes. And again, the most common thing would be burning of solid fuels, which is, common, but not common in every single household across the country. But there are a variety of other sources, even things as simple as cooking our everyday food can contribute to poor air quality inside our homes. But for the most of the rest of this talk, I will focus on primarily outdoor air pollution and what we have been doing in that arena, with maybe a couple of examples of household along the way. The other thing which often we think about is how is air pollution impacting us? And every day, or at least every week, there's news about new ways in which air pollution is impacting our life. I think the most common thing that we often can relate to is if I'm getting exposed to air pollution, I will have difficulty breathing, or it will impact my lungs. And while that is very true, and there's lots of evidence around it, a whole host of other organs and systems in our body are also impacted when we get exposed to air pollution, all the way from our brain. When we are children and get exposed to high air pollution levels, it can cause a variety of diseases in children, can also impact adults and older people of older age later in life with diseases like dementia and Alzheimer's. Of course, we have a variety of diseases linked with our lungs and our heart that can be, as a result of air pollution. And then things like diabetes, which are very common in India, also about like 1/5 of all diabetes in India can be attributed to air pollution exposure. And then pregnant women getting exposed to air pollution can result in impacts in the health of their newborns. And we're continuing to learn more. There may be other ways in which air pollution is impacting our body. And there's two major ways that we can think about this. Often, what is most visible to us or most obvious to us is the short-term exposures when you're out and about. Maybe you're in the middle of the traffic trying to get somewhere. Maybe you are, very close to a pollution source for some period of time. You might experience things like irritation in your lungs, so you might feel like coughing a lot, or your eyes might water. People who live with allergies or diseases like asthma and COPD often can see sort of, aggravation of their symptoms, or some people, there can be asthma attacks that are brought on by these very short exposures to air pollution. However, as you move away from the air pollution source or as your exposure goes down, these types of symptoms normally go away. But what stays with us for the very long term is some of the chronic diseases. So every day we're breathing in air which has some level of air pollution, depending on where you live across India, depending on where you live in a particular city, those levels may be higher or lower than others. But we are breathing in polluted air, which is resulting in a variety of long-term impacts on our lives, which may manifest now, which may manifest in 10 years. And sometimes we live with these diseases for a very long time, reducing the quality of our life, and ultimately in some cases resulting in death. So one of the things that we very commonly hear, I've heard it a lot of times, I'm sure you have too, that Indians are not as impacted by air quality, by poor air quality as easily. We can take it more because our immunity is stronger, we have healthier lungs. And often, when we hear that, it's like, well, is that true? Is that not true? And actually, it is not. Our lungs are no different than any other lungs around the world. So when air pollution levels do get high, we are getting impacted by that. Sometimes the impacts may not be visible today, they may not be visible tomorrow. But then slowly over time, these continuous exposures can build up and affect how we breathe, the capacity of our lungs. There have been many studies in children in India that have shown that the lung capacity, so how much air you can take in at any given time, is lower for children that live in higher pollution environments. So clear evidence about how the exposure around us, the pollution around us is really impacting our health on an everyday basis. So we know this is a problem. We hear, statistics all the time about how many Indians are dying as a result of air pollution exposure, how air pollution levels in Indian cities are extremely high, among the highest in the world. And with that information in mind, when we start to think of, what are we really doing to address it? Unfortunately, one of our problems is that the discourse around air pollution is still very Delhi-centric. So we are thinking about air pollution headlines in the context of what's happening in Delhi. New plans that come up in Delhi, new research studies that show us data for Delhi, how Delhi's air pollution is so bad that it's actually impacting the health of people, that it's causing economic impacts. But the problem is that Delhi isn't the only place with high air pollution levels. Across northern India in particular, if you see these two maps, they're really telling you the story about outdoor air pollution and household air pollution. So what the PM2.5 exposures are in the ambient air around us. We see, states like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Jharkhand, Rajasthan, Punjab, really high levels of exposure, 80 micrograms per meter cube of 2.5, PM2.5, 90, 100 micrograms per meter cube of PM2.5. And also, if you look at the solid fuel use, so where people are using fuels like wood or coal in some cases to cook, some of the same states show up. So across northern India and the Indo-Gangetic Plains, as we call it, air pollution levels are consistently high. So every time we're, hearing something about Delhi where air pollution level is too high or air pollution feels like a gas chamber, that is equally true for cities like Meerut and Firozabad and Allahabad and Varanasi and Jaipur. So it's not just a Delhi problem, also because our air doesn't stop at boundaries that states have come up with or that countries have come up with. We have air pollution transport across regions. Again, in the October-November timeframe, we often hear about crop burning happening or stubble burning, I should say, happening in Punjab, and that sort of gets transported downwards to Delhi and to other parts of northern India where air pollution levels can rise. So this is a problem which is not just in Delhi, but across the country. It is a problem which is, also very regional. So even if we expanded this map to all of South Asia, we are all sharing very similar problem of high air pollution levels, high percentages of people that are still relying on dirtier fuels for cooking. And we are making progress. So, every single time we hear these news headlines and stories about air pollution is really bad, things are getting worse. But there is a positive story in this too. We are making progress. And particularly the area where we have made progress so far has been in the household sector. So provision of and use of cleaner fuels for cooking, including LPG, electricity in some cases, has resulted in a reduction in the health impacts associated with household air pollution. If you look at the figures here, they're both telling us what the death rates are, so how many deaths we see for every 100,000 people in the country. And the one on the top is the crude death rate, so we're not taking into account age distribution or anything like that. The one at the bottom, we start to think, what is the age distribution? But what we notice here is the steep decline. If you see the dark blue line, starting from the 1990s until about 2019, we see a consistent reduction in what the health impacts associated with household air pollution are. Worryingly, though, in the same time frame, we see that the impact of ambient air pollution is going up. And this is very consistent with stories that we hear about air pollution levels, outdoor air pollution levels increasing in many cities. So yes, we are making progress, especially on the household side with programs like Ujjwala and those that came before it. We have been able to expand access to LPG. Ujjwala in particular has been transformational in terms of providing access to LPG to homes across the country. But what is next for us is to make sure that these people that have been now given access are actually able to use it on a consistent basis and are able to afford the fuel. It's a whole other conversation that I don't think we have time for today. So I'll come back to outdoor air pollution. As we saw in the map there, ambient PM2.5 levels across most of the country are pretty high. And then if we take a sample of some of the states in the north and east and south, looking at Delhi, which is consistently on the top here, but also Uttar Pradesh and Punjab, which are very populous states, experiencing PM2.5 levels that are pretty high. Even the states that are lower on this list is usually Assam and Tamil Nadu, and even Maharashtra. these are way above what the WHO guideline for PM2.5 is. So that is 5 micrograms per meter cube. And even their least stringent target that they say you can, that's where you can start, is 35 micrograms per meter cube. So for most states that are listed here and many others that we could add to this fold, PM2.5 levels remain very high in most parts of the country. And what this means is, as we all get exposed to these, air pollution levels, that air pollution is an important risk factor for poor health. This figure here has a lot of numbers, so I don't want you focusing on the numbers at all, but just look at the colors. The reds indicate a higher ranking for a particular risk factor. The yellows, medium ranking, and then the blues means they're lower on the list in terms of how they impact health. And across all the states that are listed here, particulate matter, which is listed as the second risk factor along the y-axis, is within the first 5, the top 5 risk factors. So it's the largest risk factor for poor health in many states, including in Delhi, in Chhattisgarh, in Bihar. It is, consistently high, even if we go to states where we don't, think that air pollution levels are as high as they are in northern India. All to say that air pollution as an environmental health risk factor is causing immense health impacts, and that then translates into economic impacts, into healthcare costs and other ways in which it can impact our productivity and our well-being. So there are many people who are aware about this problem and who are very active in this, whole air pollution discourse across the country, including governments at the national, state level and local level, also our judiciary, which for many years has been very active in trying to implement regulations and bring in policies that would help reduce the air pollution burden. Civil society is growing and very vibrant, tackling air pollution from a variety of perspectives, from coming up with new ways to address air pollution, to sensitization, to creating a demand for clean air among communities that most need it, and connecting them back to the main sort of air pollution discourse we have at the national level. And of course, the academic and research institutions, which are the powerhouses for producing data and information and evidence that can help bolster all the other efforts that are ongoing. And increasingly, a lot of entrepreneurs who are thinking about air pollution as a problem in creative ways. How can we try and address the sources of air pollution, reduce emissions, try and reduce people's exposures to air pollution? And then in all of this, media plays an important role too, because they help us get the message out. They help us connect the science and the policy back to the people. And that cycle is sort of continuous. So different stakeholders are often engaging with each other. In some cases, they're working together. In many other cases, they're essentially picking up where the other one leaves off. So if a research institution or an academic institution is producing new science, then groups in sort of the civil society space or in media can report on it and can use it to increase public engagement and awareness around the issues. And that way, over the last at least 6-7 years in particular, the conversations around air pollution are becoming very rich. They're becoming broader. So we are trying to move away from the Delhi-centric conversations. We're trying to go into more regional, state level, city level conversations about air pollution. The media is reporting more on it. There's more research. City governments and state governments are paying more attention to the problem of air pollution as well. And a lot of it has come about because we have access to more information and more data. And that again is happening for a few reasons. In the last 10-15 years, if you see the research output related to air pollution, levels of air pollution, sources of air pollution, how it impacts health has been consistently increasing. thereby, giving us more information to play with and to use and work with. At the same time as we, use low-cost sensors and satellite data that are available, labs in many universities across India are expanding modeling capabilities. So we are able to get more information in real time on what the air pollution levels might be. There's forecasting systems that have been developed now. And there is a growing attention on the air pollution problem in India, within the country, but also internationally as a place where air pollution is an issue that we need to tackle. So we've also seen an increase in funding over time. And all of this together with, the power of social media and the fact that so many people use it has meant that the message is increasingly reaching more people than it did even 5 years ago or a decade ago. What I mean when I say increase in research output is that we have growing collaboration. So not just one scientist doing a study and publishing it, but large collaborations that are forming with universities across the country. There are increasingly collaborations that are public-private in nature, where universities and research institutions are partnering with private companies to try and come up with innovative solutions. One example of that is the work that IIT Kanpur and Dr. Sajid Tripathi has been doing around low-cost sensors, trying to expand the reach of low-cost sensors, thereby how much information we have on air pollution from the ground in specific cities and specific states. There's also larger programs like the Coalesce program, which a number of institutions across the country are working on, trying to think of carbonaceous aerosols, where they come from, and how we can use that information in the future for policy solutions. There's also more research on the health side. We have seen a renewed focus on trying to understand both the risks that come with exposure to air pollution, the impacts on people's health, and very interestingly and importantly, studies that are now beginning to look at how the impacts would vary if we were to change how our business as usual is functioning. And just a case in point there is that, between 2000 and 2022, we've seen an increase in PubMed hits. So PubMed is a sort of online database where you can search for peer-reviewed literature. And if I just do a very, very basic search for air pollution in India, what we see is that the number of studies that get published on this topic are increasing over time, and it's consistently rising, increasing the level of information we have available. One specific piece that a lot of people have been focusing on as well is, as we think of air pollution levels, how high they are, and how to mitigate them, we want to know what the sources of air pollution are, and where they matter more and which sources to tackle. And with some of the recent programs, we've had a lot of focus on source apportionment, trying to understand which sources are contributing to air pollution and to what degree. And there, two primary approaches have been used. One is what we call the accounting approach, where you're trying to start with the emission. So what's coming out of the source, that could be a tailpipe of a car, that could be a smokestack, that could be a brick kiln, and then trying to account for each source in a systematic manner to come up with what the contributions of individual sources might be. The other approach, which is also very commonly used for source apportionment studies, is trying to look at what's in the air today. So I could look at PM2.5 levels in the air today, and for the next several days, and maybe across the seasons, and then try to work backwards on where it came from, which is sort of the top-down approach. We are starting with the PM2.5 levels, and then we're trying to break it down and say, where did this come from? This requires a lot of, sampling of air pollution, collection of filters, and then so on. So both of these approaches are now being used by scientists and also by other research institutions, think tanks, to try and understand where is the air pollution in our country coming from. At the same time, there has been a huge interest and increase in the number of citizen groups, civil society groups that are engaging on the issue of air pollution, directly demanding that air pollution action be taken. Whether that is, people going out and protesting, trying to ask for clean air, whether it is innovative ideas like setting up long billboards, which can give you a very visual look of what air pollution is like, and whether it is groups trying to engage with local and state level policymakers directly to suggest solutions and to figure out ways to implement them that would bring meaningful change and improve the air quality. One question that continues to come up, and also, just yesterday was being discussed in the parliament, is the evidence on health effects of air pollution. So we know from the global literature, studies that have been conducted in North America, in Europe, in Asia, and other places, that air pollution has huge impacts on people's health. We see relatively consistent evidence of how air pollution affects health. And even in the Indian context, if we start to think about some of the common ways in which we would think about air pollution affecting our health, we have robust and growing evidence. For example, in Tamil Nadu, there have been studies that are supported by ICMR, the Indian Council for Medical Research, which show that increase in exposure to air pollution, especially PM2.5 during pregnancy, can result in babies being born with a lower birth weight than what is normal. We have also seen studies from Telangana and elsewhere that see a positive association between ambient PM2.5 and blood pressure and hypertension. Another study, which was published for Delhi recently, found that increases in PM2.5 levels over short periods of time can result in increases or increased risk for mortality, for deaths. So there's evidence, along the spectrum on how air pollution exposure is impacting the health of newborns and adults and older aged adults. So there is a reason and there is a lot of information for us to draw on how air pollution is affecting our health in very direct ways using evidence generated by scientists in India. And one effort that I want to point out and draw people's attention to is this collaborative for health effects research, which was established last year in 2021. And this is being led by AIMS, New Delhi, and IIT Delhi. And the idea is for this network to be a place where scientists and researchers talking and thinking about air pollution, atmospheric chemistry, air pollution and meteorology, modeling, exposure science, and also epidemiologists and public health scientists can all come together to think carefully about what evidence is available, what research is needed, and how we can best communicate it. And this work is being supported by the Health Effects Institute. So if this is the type of research you're interested in, I would encourage you to look this up. We also have seen a lot of actions around air pollution control. We haven't, done nothing at all. And in fact, in case of Delhi, just as an example, also as one of the cities where the most action has been taken over the years, we've seen different types of air pollution interventions all the way from 1980s to now, which started with a public interest litigation to try and get industries out of Delhi in the late 1980s, followed by a push for waste management regulation, trying to bring in regulation for vehicle emission standards. And then specifically in Delhi, one of the landmark decisions was to try and convert the diesel fleet to CNG, and phase out older vehicles from the road. And that is a policy that is still continuing, which has also been brought in other places. There have been very targeted efforts as well to try and address individual air pollution sources. Some of the power plants have been switched to natural gas or they've been shut down. There has been a ban on open burning. A lot of small scale industries were moved outside the city. There has been a focus on trying to promote public transportation so that people can switch to that. And then in more recent years, there have been very targeted efforts trying to regulate and manage the air pollution problem with things like the Graded Response Action Plan, which means, which generally asks that as the air quality levels deteriorate with each step, certain interventions kick in automatically. And they vary quite a bit in their scope, but all in efforts to try and bring down those air pollution levels when they're very high. And then the Commission on Air Quality Management that has come in is again another effort to think about it from a broader perspective of not just the Delhi city, but the entire National Capital Territory region, or the NCT. And we'll see where this progress goes. Again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, there has been a lot of focus on Delhi. We need to see similar things happen elsewhere in Indian cities and towns and states. But even beyond Delhi, there have been a number of very broad interventions. The most notable being the recent National Clean Air Program that was launched in 2019. This is the first ever plan addressing air pollution, which is trying to reduce PM2.5 and PM10 levels by a quantifiable target. So the idea is to reduce the levels by 20 to 30% by 2024 relative to the 2017 levels, and started with about 100 cities. It's now grown to 132 cities. But it is a program which has brought a lot of attention to the issue in the state and local levels, because cities had to come up with their clean air action plans, having to think about which priority actions they can take so that they can meet these targets. And this has also resulted in a lot of investment into programming around air pollution at state level. Several international bilateral agencies, multilateral agencies, philanthropies have been supporting work that's happening in individual cities or at the state level. The government at the national scale, again, has also prioritized access to LPG for households, which has been a continuing theme for a long time, but especially with the Ujjwala Yojana that was ramped up a lot. And now many more households have access to LPG. And now, we have to tackle the issue of affordability. We also have emission standards for coal-fired power plants across the country. However, those have been very slow in implementation, with a lot of deadlines that have been missed or moved over time. And then one recent change, which was essentially a leapfrog, so it was not even one step up, was the implementation of the Bharat Stage 6 emission standards, which again, over some years are going to help bring improvements in air quality, not just in Delhi, but in many parts of the country. So the one other thing very quickly that I want to mention is this is all outdoor air pollution, what's around us, but depending on where I spend time and you spend time, our actual exposure to air pollution may be very different. It really depends on how old we are, where we live, where we work, how we travel. Is it by bus? Is it by motorbike? Is it by auto rickshaws, by car? And for people in different occupations, for people living in different parts of the country, in the city, this will vary quite a bit. A couple of examples here. Again, don't worry too much about the axes. What I want you to focus on is the peaks. These are PM2.5 and black carbon exposure levels monitored for a woman over a 48-hour period. And all the peaks that you see here, where they were getting exposed to 100, 200 micrograms per meter cube of PM2.5, were doing cooking in their home with LPG, not with not with any solid fuels, and still the exposure levels were pretty high, or during commute to work when they were trying to get to work or back from work. And a couple of years ago, or last year, my timeline is a little bit murky on this. There was a feature article in the New York Times that compared exposure levels for two kids for a 24-hour period, trying to look at what their exposures were. And what they found is that for one of them, the exposure was about 150 micrograms. For the other one, was under 40 micrograms. And essentially, the difference between these two was where they live and how much they could afford to use things like air purifiers to try and reduce exposures or not be outdoors when the air pollution levels are high. So if you're interested in issues around how our activities and occupations and what we do and where we live can impact, I would suggest looking this up. It should still be available. And the reason they focused on children is because they are particularly vulnerable to exposure to air pollution, partly because they are still growing. Their lungs are still growing. So any impact on, their lungs now is going to be an impact for the rest of their life. Children tend to inhale more air than adults, which means they may be breathing in a higher fraction of the air pollution compared to a regular adult. So as we think of how to reduce air pollution and also where to focus our efforts, children are an important component of any of that decision-making process and how we can reduce exposures for children as much as possible. But unfortunately, there are no silver bullet solutions. We won't be able to control one source and say, this is it, we've addressed the problem. There are a number of sources that are important, either at the national scale. So the two figures that you see here are looking at averages across several studies on what the major sources are. At the national level, residential solid fuel use comes up as a big source that we can tackle, there are efforts to tackle it. We could do more. And then other sources like electricity generation or transportation, begin to show up, industries show up at the national level. But when we switch to the local scale, at the city level, what's going on, often the biggest contributions are coming from transportation or waste burning. So how we think about solutions at the national scale and at the local scale can be quite different, and which sources we prioritize for action at the city level versus at the national level can also vary quite a bit depending on how we set our targets. Also, since this is a sort of science-oriented talk to some extent, evidence on air quality and health impacts can be used to influence policy very significantly, because we can use evidence on air pollution and health to make a case that there is a problem, and then also test how and which sources are contributing to the impacts we see, and eventually, as interventions are brought in, look at how those help to improve air quality over time and improve the public health over time, so that we can continue with policy interventions that work, that can be replicated and scaled up across the country. Just a quick couple of final thoughts. Air quality management and measurement in India is still in a growing phase. We're trying to establish new monitoring stations. We're thinking of new governance scheme. And in a recent analysis, we looked at what good components of an air quality measurement system are. And the two main things I want to highlight here are, one, it's not just about making the measurements and putting them, making sure they are QA/QC'd. It is also about ensuring that all the relevant stakeholders that could be using this information are involved in the process and can contribute and use the process to continue the work they do. And then this is a dynamic activity. We cannot use the one and done approach that we come up with a system that works today and then expect that that's what we're going to focus on, for the rest of our times. We will need to continuously make adjustments and improvements and modifications as our capabilities in measurements or in using data for various application improves. Similarly, for air quality management, this has to be a continuous process. There's, public demand for clean air, as we see increasingly everyone wants cleaner air. But this has to be nestled within what long-term action that is sustainable and that will actually bring emissions reduction are we taking, and how the different processes and different steps in this can feed into each other. So it's not responding to an air pollution episode that happens today. It is responding to the air pollution problem that a city has or that the country has. So trying to keep it dynamic, again, trying to bring in as many stakeholders into the process as possible, and through the process ensuring that there's enough capacity to deal with the issue, the right kind of technical expertise, the right kind of policy expertise that will help bring in policies that actually bring change and that can lead to cleaner air over time. And then the final thing I'm going to leave you with is, often as scientists, we want to be publishing a lot and thinking about what papers we can get out, but how can that be connected back to policy and back to advocacy? Scientists don't need to be advocates, but what are the ways in which scientific data and evidence can be useful for advocacy, for communication, for public engagement? And also thinking about the justice aspect and the equity aspect of the whole issue. So I know we're close to time, so I will close with this and happy to answer any questions that people might have. Thank you.